Remember the moving walkway we talked about last time? Last time, we mostly focused on the people on the walkway and their reactions to the motion of the conveyor belt. But what about the walkway itself? Why is it moving? And why does it move toward racism? If we take a closer look at the society, at the mechanisms, institutions, and practices that shape it and drive it, lots of them are inherently built on racism, or encourage racism. Things like police brutality, media stereotypes, barriers to education, housing segregation, and the school-to-prison pipeline all interact and feed off each other to produce what we call structural racism. That affects everybody in the society. Let's look at how two of these gears, housing segregation and barriers to education, interact with each other to move society toward racism. So after the National Housing Act of 1934, there opened the way for a practice called redlining, where investors would map a city by race and specifically only fund areas where white people lived, further segregating people of color into poor areas and calling it their fault. Today, redlining is illegal, but it still has a ripple effect on today's world. Check out the remains of Arlington's segregation wall, built around predominantly black neighborhoods to raise real estate values of nearby white owners in the 1930s. It wasn't torn down until 1966. There's also still habitual bias in the real estate market toward white owners. According to a study in 2012 by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, black buyers were shown 17.7% fewer houses than white buyers in the same neighborhood by the same agent. This forces black buyers into renting instead of buying, into uglier and less functional buildings, into poorer neighborhoods. This is where housing segregation leads into barriers to education. Since public schools are funded by property taxes on nearby houses, a black couple forced into a low-value house is going to have to send their kid to an underfunded school, while the white couple who was shown the high-value house gets to send their kid to a well-funded school. These two kids will have very different school experiences. The black student school is likely to have low-paid teachers, second-rate equipment, and very few activities and opportunities. The white student school is more likely to have well-qualified teachers, after-school activities, challenging classes, and other resources. The students will be shaped by those experiences and pushed toward different paths. This is just one example of how structural racism can interfere with fairness and justice and perpetuate racial disparities outside of individual control. Throughout these seminars, we will come back to the concept of structural racism and discuss how to identify, talk about, and interrupt the gears of the walkway. Here's the quote this video was based off of. Structural racism is the silent opportunity killer. It is the blind interaction between institutions, policies, and practices that inevitably perpetuates barriers to opportunities and racial disparities. Conscious and unconscious racism continue to exist in our society, but structural racism feeds on the unconscious. Public and private institutions and individuals each build a wall. They do not necessarily build the wall to hurt people of color, but one wall is joined by another until they construct a labyrinth from which few can escape. They have walled in whole communities. What do you think of this quote?